Hello and welcome to a brand new video. Today, in the spirit of the spooky holiday season, I thought we could talk about one of my favorite horror movies. This is a video I've been wanting to make for a long time. So sit back, relax, grab yourself a drink, and let's talk about The Lighthouse. The Lighthouse is a horror/thriller film directed and written by Robert and Max Eggers. The vast majority of this film is spent with our two main characters, who are portrayed by Robert Pattinson and Willem Dafoe. This is a movie that is shot on film and is at a 1:1 aspect ratio, making the whole movie feel very dark and claustrophobic. The first 8 minutes of the film is spent just taking in the world around us. A lot of this movie is influenced by the real life happenings of a happenstance where 3 lighthouse keepers disappeared. So if you go into the movie kind of knowing that, you can kind of get a feel for what's about to happen. During the first 8 minutes of this film, it's actually very quiet. There's not a lot of dialogue going on, and a lot of the sounds that you hear are the crashing waves, the seagulls, and a foghorn on repeat. This is all happening while the main characters are on a boat being taken to the main island where the lighthouse is. And as soon as our characters get settled, we finally get our first bit of dialogue, and immediately the tension between these two characters sets in. Throughout the whole film, they're always at each other's throats. And for 2 seconds, they may get along, and then they're right back at it. But it is during this first bit of dialogue that we are actually properly introduced into our characters and their roles. Willem Dafoe plays Thomas Wake, who I will be referring to as Wake throughout this video. He has this unhealthy obsession with the light of the lighthouse. And we get a feel for Robert Pattinson's character, who I will be referring to as Winslow. And Winslow just wants the 4 weeks to be over with and then hitch a ride back to the mainland. It's with our first night at the lighthouse that we get a sense for how sinister this island is. The lighthouse itself, the actual light with the glass around it, has a very Twilight Zone, Lovecraftian sort of atmosphere to it. It seems almost otherworldly and set apart from our two characters. It's also during this first night where we start to get those dark visions of tentacles and mermaids and a body. Our first proper day on the island itself, we get to see what is kind of the routine for the rest of the movie between our two characters. Winslow is doing a lot of the bottom of the barrel hard chores that no one really wants to do, and Wake just kind of supervises and belittles him and gripes at him, telling him he's not really doing a proper job, and also dropping these little bits of superstition along the way. And it's during these chores that we get to see that Winslow is very quick to anger. Something that is a big part of his character is his rage. As we spend time with the characters as they go through about their routine, it's also during this bit of routine that we start to get more information about what happened to the second keeper that Winslow replaced. Wake tells us how he went crazy and was on and on about how the light would bring him to salvation. And it's during this conversation that we find out more of Wake's superstitions, and he warns Winslow to never kill a seabird. And from there, our characters continue about their typical day. Winslow is doing the chores, and Wake proceeds to just give him a hard time, whether it be dangling him from a not safe rope and watching him fall to the ground, or just belittling him in his work, making him scrub the floor over and over. It's also during this time that we're introduced to the logbook that Wake keeps, and this is something that we will see again at the very end of the movie, so just keep that in your pocket. Every night when our characters sit down to eat, Wake makes a point to have what I like to call a supper's prayer. It's more so of like a toast, but he makes it routine before they eat their meal, like you would have a prayer before supper, and he gets very upset when Winslow doesn't really want to participate. And there's even one night where he asks Winslow to kind of lead it, and he kind of does a half-assed job at it. But during these dinners, it's one of the few moments where we see these two characters try and get along. During the day, they're doing their separate jobs or at each other's throat, and most of the time during the night, they're also at each other's throat. But it's during these sequences when they're dining or drinking that they kind of see eye to eye. It's a very complex relationship between these two characters. You can tell that they absolutely hate each other, and they hate each other for really no reason. They hardly know each other, but they've just decided that they're going to hate each other. But they're also the only two people on this island, so in order to get through it, they need to have their little moments where they can try and get along. They're each other's only source of entertainment. So it's during these nighttime drinking conversations that we find out more about Wake and his bad leg, and also about how he is truly obsessed with the light. He refers to it as his wife, and he is very possessive over it, making sure that Winslow knows that he in no time soon will be going up there at all. Winslow himself as a character tends to keep a lot of his past to himself, but throughout the film you can really see that he wants to open up, and it's very funny how Wake calls him out on this, saying that he's not as mysterious as he thinks he is. And starting at the middle and throughout the rest of the film, Winslow starts to spill more about who he actually is. It starts with him talking about how he ended up on this island, how he's worked a lot of different jobs, and he used to work in the timber industry, and now he has wound up here for a change of scenery. Wake is very quick to call him out, asking if he is a man on the run, and Winslow gets extremely defensive. During one of our days, Winslow goes to get a drink of water and finds that it's just a bunch of muck coming through. He goes to check the water supply, and he finds a seagull in there. The seagull is not doing very well. At this time, another seagull comes and lands on top of where the water supply is, and Winslow just beats the living daylights out of it. These seagulls have been driving him mad since he got there, and so it was only a matter of time until he did not heed Wake's warning and took all his frustration out on a seagull. It's at this moment where there's an immediate shift in the atmosphere. We see the weather vane immediately change directions of the wind, and Wake is very quick to notice. He calls him out, and as Winslow kind of brushes it off, we get this line from Wake where he says that this is just the calm before the storm, and that the upcoming eastern winds will sound like Gabriel's horn. That night, we get another dinner toast, supper prayer, and another bit of Wake being possessive over the light. The following day, Winslow happens upon a mermaid, and it's up to interpretation whether this is something that actually happens. Once Winslow realizes what he sees, he kind of has a freak out and screams and runs away, and as he runs back into the keeper house, Wake just says, what are you screaming about? Not that he heard two people screaming, but that only Winslow was screaming. They get ready to pack up because the boat is supposed to come and pick them up so that way they can swap their shifts, and the boat doesn't come. The storm is too bad. The boat doesn't come, the storm has gotten worse, and it's gotten into their food supply. Their food supply. It's gotten into their food supply, meaning that they are going to have to start rationing. And Wake has this moment where he's kind of gaslighting Winslow and saying that he has told him all along that they should have been rationing their food, and he's just very aggressive towards him about this whole ordeal. During this night where they have their time where they're just sitting and talking to pass the night away, Wake changes the story about his bad leg, saying now instead of it breaking, he got it because of scurvy. And Winslow is very quick to call him out on the change in his story. And Wake just kind of brushes him off, saying, you must have misheard me. When they're at each other's throats, Winslow makes a comment about how he can't stand Wake's food, and Wake takes this quite personally. And it ends up in the most terrifying monologue I've ever seen. When I first watched this movie, I felt I was being yelled at and cursed by Willem Dafoe. And watching it a second time, I know it's coming, so it's a little less intense, but it's equally as terrifying just listening to the words and the delivery. But yes, Wake curses Winslow in the most terrifying monologue I have seen. At this point, Winslow is just done with Wake. The next day, there's a certain sequence that takes place, and I'm not really going to talk about it too much because it's not appropriate for YouTube, and I like to kind of keep it PG over here. But my opinion is that it was just a dream sequence, and that's really all we're going to talk about that. The next day, while Winslow is out trying to catch some fish, he ends up finding a head with a missing eye. And it's very interesting because earlier in the movie, I didn't really talk about this, but I'll bring it up now because it's relevant. There's a seagull that lands on his leg when he falls from the rope swing I was talking about. And there's a seagull that lands on his leg and he only has one eye, just like this head that he caught while fishing. Very interesting. We have another night sequence where there's a lot of drinking, and it's during this time that Winslow confesses that his name is not, in fact, Winslow. It is Tom Howard, and that he took the name Winslow from his superior at the timber mill, that there was an accident and that it wasn't his fault, and that he left Tom Howard behind and took his old boss's name, and thus ended up here. During this whole time, Wake makes it a really big part of don't spill your beans to me, because in Winslow's drunken state, he wants to come clean and kind of clear his conscience. And the whole time, Wake is just saying, like, don't spill your beans. Why'd you spill your beans? Then we get this iconic sequence where Winslow goes to the top of the lighthouse and he grabs what appears to be Wake's body and turns him over. And that's when we see that Winslow is looking at himself. And then he is grabbed on the shoulder and by Willem Dafoe in his birthday suit, and he sends this beam of light into Winslow's eyes. To me, this is very symbolic of that Winslow is looking at his past self, who has died as he's taken on this new moniker, and Wake is seeing him for who he truly is. That was my takeaway from this. It's a little quick and jarring. It kind of catches you off guard, but that was my takeaway. Next day, Winslow tries to leave. He says that he doesn't care about the storm. He just wants to get off this island, and Wake comes in with an axe, preventing him from doing so. So now we've reached the end and the big climax of the film. And during this whole part of, Wake chasing him with an axe and eventually, asks him, like, maybe this is all a dream. Maybe I'm just a figment of your imagination and you're up in Canada stuck in the cold wilderness and you're hallucinating, and just laying into him. It's at this point where Winslow reveals that he's read the captain's log, which Wake has referred to as his gospel. And we find out that Wake has written how Winslow is a terrible worker and he has woken up late and done terrible things while on the job, and that he should be relieved without severance pay. And Winslow is not happy with this information at all. He feels betrayed and that he is a hard worker, and the whole time Wake is just calling him out on how he has been lying to himself. It's also in this argument that Winslow throws it back at Wake, saying that he's basically full of beans and that he's a parody of what sailors are, and all of his stories are made up and phony, and he's just a guy at a lighthouse who's never been a sailor. Then we have this moment where Winslow attacks Wake, and we see him shift from his old supervisor into a mermaid, and then into what I think is Wake's true form, which is this octopus Neptune looking being. And after this, it's calm outside. After this fight, Wake just kind of rolls over and accepts defeat, and Winslow makes him bark like a dog in a very humiliating sort of way. It's then that we see them exit the lodging house, and Winslow is leading Willem Dafoe on a lead. And the whole time I was watching the scene, all I could think of was, like, poor Willem Dafoe. I bet that hurts so badly, crawling on his knees like that on, like, all this rocky, hilly terrain. But anyways, Winslow eventually leads him to a hole that they dug earlier to get, pretty sure it was booze, when they needed more rations. He leads him back to that hole and makes him lie down in it. And he proceeds to cover him with dirt, burying him alive. He stops pretty early as Willem Dafoe is giving another monologue, and then convinces him that he can show him the light. It's at this moment that Winslow realizes that he has the keys on him, and he decides to stop covering him with dirt. And also poor Willem Dafoe for having to talk as dirt is being shoveled into his mouth. But Winslow takes the keys, decides to leave him and head up to the light. But before he decides to unlock it, he heads back into the lodging to grab something. And then Wake comes running in with the axe and hits Winslow's arm. And when there's a bit of a tussle, and then Winslow takes the axe and finishes off Wake. And then Winslow delivers what I call a prayer. It's very similar to the types of speeches that they give at supper time. Winslow then crawls up to the top of the lighthouse, opens the locked grate, proceeds up, and it's when we see the light itself begins to open, and Tom stares into it in what looks to be awe and relief, and then he screams. He then proceeds to fall down the stairs leading up to the light, and then we get a cut to the Prometheus scene where we can see seagulls picking at his insides, and that is how the film ends. Okay, so what does this all mean? What the heck is going on? And what is my interpretation? Because everyone and their mother had an interpretation whenever this came out, and I'm very late to the party, but I love this movie, and I want to give my own interpretation because I think it's a little different than what other people seem to think, and that's okay. As a disclaimer, the fun thing about art is that the viewer can interpret it as ever they see fit. If you think something different, then please let me know, because this is one of my favorite discussions to have, because this movie is so topsy-turvy, and I think that there's a lot of really cool imagery that you can pull from as evidence. But anyways, here is my interpretation of what The Lighthouse is about. The Lighthouse is a story about the punishment of Thomas Howard, our Winslow character, in his own personal hell. From the very beginning of the film, I don't believe that we were ever on an island off of the northeast coast at a lighthouse. I believe that the boat that our characters were brought in was a stand-in for the ferryman on the River Styx. That's the boat that brings in the dead souls into the underworld. From the very moment that Thomas Howard entered hell, we begin to see his torment led by his very own personal demon, who is Wake, Thomas Wake. I think that Tom and Thomas having the same name was very intentional, as throughout the movie we see glimpses of how Tom's own, or Winslow's own conscience is trying to get him to confess and feel sorry for what he's done in the past, but he can never quite bring himself to properly repent. And with Thomas Wake calling him out on all of his lies, I feel like this further illustrates that. Now, because Winslow, Tom, is in hell, there are many other forms of torture besides Wake. There's the temptations that are presented to him, be it the lust temptation with the siren, or his rage that he's constantly dealing with the seagulls that just drive him mad. And of course, the temptation of alcohol, which in itself, alcohol is not a bad thing, but when you indulge too much, then that's when it becomes sin. And that only gets worse whenever they run out of actual booze and instead turn to the oil or kerosene that they use in order to fuel the light. So the way that I see the light, I can see it in two different directions. One I think is a little more likely than the other. My first idea for what this light and the lighthouse represents is God. Very early into the film, when discussing the light, we're introduced to the idea that this light is the representation of salvation. And throughout the entire film, there's lots of calls to gospel and Gabriel and hell and God. Tom, or Winslow, didn't repent for his sins, even though he was given a few different opportunities to do so. And instead, he decided to seek salvation in a way that he didn't quite earn. It was almost like he had the opportunity to escape his hell. You could even see this as like a purgatory, and if he was between heaven and hell and he just made the wrong choice. And that's why the Prometheus ending is his proper eternal hellscape. And the other way I can see the light is just another form of temptation for the characters, but I think that's a very weak argument, and I think that the first one is a lot more interesting and makes a lot more sense. There's a lot of different Christian references and imagery throughout the film, be it the speeches or what I like to call the supper's prayer. And again, there's the call to the logbook being like gospel and Gabriel's horns being the storm. The Lighthouse, under its northeastern coastal charm, is a story about a man's failure to redemption and his punishment for the sins in his life, as he suffers through his own personal hell led by his own personal demon, which I think the tentacle form is his actual true form. And he is constantly reminded of how he ended up here during his torment, being forced to not only relive certain parts of his past through the visions that he sees, but also being constantly told that he is a terrible person and a liar. And when presented the opportunity to a attempt at redemption and repenting, he ultimately fails in his last chance of redemption, resulting in his eternal afterlife being one of suffering. And that's pretty much it. That's my interpretation of The Lighthouse. I know that there are a lot of people who focus more on the Prometheus ending, but I think that that's a little misguided. There's a lot of other religious imagery in the form of, the Prometheus ending and also Neptune. But there's so much Christian imagery that it fits because of the time that this movie is supposed to take place. But I think those lines of dialogue were written with a much deeper intention. That's my interpretation. If you have a different idea of what this movie is actually about, I would love to hear it, because it's one that's deeply fascinating to me. I know a lot of people take different things away from this movie, but that was my takeaway. And it was really fun to finally talk about and sit and force myself to actually figure this out, because the first time I watched this movie, I had no idea what I just watched. It was just really, really good and very thought-provoking. And I wanted to actually force myself to sit and basically annotate as I was watching. And it was a lot of fun. So I hope that you had a lot of fun. And if you would like to see more of my face, don't forget to like, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll see you next time. Bye!